Today we have the immense privilege of hosting Mark Logan, who is the former COO of the infamous and wildly used worldwide startup called Skyscanner. So welcome, Mark. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for having me. Hi, everyone.
So Mark, could you tell us a little bit about yourself? How did you get started with entrepreneurship in general?
Yeah, certainly. So, well, first of all, good evening, everyone. Thank you for giving up your Friday to listen to me. I'll try not to be boring. There's a lot of folklore about why people get into startups, and I think if you listen to the stories that people tell, in retrospect, they're always airbrushed and polished, and it gives the impression that entrepreneurship is only for some people because, it's a certain type of mind and, they had this great vision and so on. But it's not really like that. So when I started into entrepreneurship, I was working, I'd graduated and I was working for BT in the research labs as a software engineer, and kind of knew that wasn't really what I wanted to do long term, but that was the job that was available. Now we're in a sort of recession just now, or close to. When I graduated, there was another really large recession, and when I graduated, like 1 in 3 of us were getting jobs, so it was a really difficult time. So I was in BT Research Labs doing interesting work, but a colleague of mine and I, we started at night building a database for neonatal intensive care, would you believe? Because his wife was a neonatal doctor, and she was telling us about the problems they had with recording the young baby's conditions and so on and so forth. So we started writing this Microsoft Access database when that was a cool technology, and we actually sold it to 4 hospitals, amazingly. Nowadays that would be a lot harder to sell software to hospitals, and we were a bit nervous about this because selling a database to hospitals that record neonatal intensive care records is a bit scary when you're 22 years old and you're not sure if your software is very good. And at the same time, I'd also left BT to join this startup. I'd met this founder, and he was very visionary and exciting. And it was at the dawn of the broadband age, where nowadays we've all got broadband internet at home, but in those days we didn't. And this was at the very dawn of that, before it was really available. And he wanted to do something in this space. So I decided to leave BT and join his company. So I found myself in 2 startups simultaneously, the one I was doing and this other one. And it meant that I was coming home at night and coding all night or things like that. So
when did you have time to sleep then?
Well, it's lots of young people here. You tell me, when you don't really need to sleep as much when you're younger. But we decided we had to decide, which way we're going to go. So we tried to sell the software to a company, and various companies would have taken it, but they wanted us to keep developing it, and they would take 80% of the profits to distribute it. So we decided actually just to pull out of that and focus on the other startup. And so I was like employee 5 in this startup. And we'll get into it perhaps, but long story short, we sold that startup for $180 million. Some years later to Cisco. So it was probably the right decision. But my point is that, I was a pretty introverted, still am, pretty introverted person. I didn't see myself as an entrepreneur. I just wanted to build things, and I just wanted to, explore the undiscovered country of trying to make some kind of dent in the world, and seeing what would happen if I wrote some product and would people use it. So it was not all thought out, it was not a great vision, it was just giving it a go, to be honest. But I discovered I really enjoyed that life, and we can talk maybe about why that was. But my point is, don't exclude yourself or disqualify yourself because you don't sound like Jeff Bezos when he stands up, or you don't have a vision just yet. People will tell you why you can't do things in life, but never negotiate against yourself. If you want to give it a try, give it a try.
So you believe that everyone can be an entrepreneur?
Yeah, what I believe is that entrepreneurial instinct is innate in the human condition. And what I mean by that is, the reason that you're all here is because your ancestors were able to survive. It's innate because the reason you have an innate ability to be entrepreneurial is because that's how we used to survive. Life was a lot tougher once, and you had to use all sorts of resources to do that. So it is innate within us. And then the education system tells us that we're not entrepreneurial. It really prepares us for working in factories. The education system is the same as it was 50, 100 years ago. So you think about it, you've got to turn up at this time, do these things, pass these exams. It's conditioning you to believe that you're part of a larger unit. And sometimes we forget that we can be entrepreneurial. And then we see these exemplars of entrepreneurship who are not like us, and that further convinces us we shouldn't do that. But I believe that everyone has the innate ability to do it. And that doesn't mean everyone's going to be a successful entrepreneur, but as a first step, everyone's capable of doing it. I say, if you have the desire to explore it, then explore it, and you'll find out if you're good at it or not.
So my first question to that would be, how do then we decondition ourselves from what society and school system, kindergarten perhaps, what is it doing to us? How do we give ourselves that understanding and that feeling that we can achieve our goals? Well,
the first thing you do is you give up your Friday and come to events like this and hear someone like me saying, you give it a go. And the fact that you're here means you already know this. That's the point. Otherwise you wouldn't be here. And then I think you learn a lot from trying things. We spend a lot of time rehearsing for life, and then suddenly we're 70 and we never actually got on the stage. So sometimes it's worth just kind of getting on the stage and seeing what happens. Sometimes people will throw roses at you, sometimes they'll throw tomatoes, but you've got to get on the stage to find out. So I would, if I was you and you were interested in exploring life in a startup or doing your own thing, then go do it. And you'll make horrendous mistakes, but when I think about the mistakes I made, there's a huge number of them, but you learn a lot from those things. You've got to be out living life, practicing it, not reading about it. It's interesting. I look at how, for example, engineering's taught, less so in computing, but engineering, for example. Now, the engineers of the past, they had laboratories, they had workshops, they made things, they tried to derive and induce, rules and laws from that, and then they iterated. When we teach engineering in a university, we spend the first 3 years not touching anything physical. We just do the maths. And you've got to get out there and get your hands dirty or get your minds, engaged with people, with customers. And yet then you soon focus on those kind of things rather than what you were told you couldn't do. So just get out there, I think, is the trick.
Touch more things, interact with your environment and see what the environment says back to you. And again, just don't negotiate against yourself. Don't talk yourself out of things, because we're very good at doing that. People will always tell you why you can't do stuff, and they often tell you that. Sometimes they tell you out of love because they're concerned for you, but often they tell you that out of envy, because their own fear, perhaps.
Yeah, or they're like too old and they wish they'd done it, so it's better if you don't do it too, or they just don't know any better. You've got to listen to advice, but a mark of a great founder is to take a lot of advice and then make up their own mind. So you want to do that now in your life. You've got to have agency in your life, and trying things is a great way to explore entrepreneurship. Just go out there and try it.
Thank you for your advice. I want to ask, so basically you said that when you were just starting out, you wanted to tap the untapped and create new technologies, new services, right? Do you think that there is now, in today's world in 2023, that there is less possibility for this growth and for this building of something that's not been built yet, because there's so many things now, AI and everything coming into play?
No, I think it's actually the other way around. And how do I justify that? We're constantly given new tools. What we haven't seen out yet is a world that fully uses those tools. In retrospect, it's always obvious. But when I was at the age of most people in this room, people would have asked, or posed the same question to each other: is it too late? And it wasn't. So what you find is that the platform is getting deeper. So when I was starting out as a programmer, we had to write our own event loops and message programming. So you spent a lot of time doing that and less time building product. Now you can take a lot of stuff and then say, okay, standing on that platform, what can we do now? Now you can write, you can build apps. We don't have to do any coding at all. So that lets you engage more with the problem you're trying to solve. So I think that environment's richer than ever before. And of course, you're the generation growing up at the dawn of the second path of the exponential and AI. So, I'm sure you're all thinking about ChatGPT and what does that mean and similar tools. What that will do is it will change a lot of jobs, but it will also create a lot of new opportunities as well. So Jack Ma said that problems are a good thing for entrepreneurs because they create new opportunities to solve them. And your environment is changing quite rapidly. And what you need to do is say, in this world we're now in, what are the opportunities? Not what were they before this happened or before that happened. So an entrepreneur, a startup kind of person is often looking at, with the world as it now is or where it's going to be next year or in 5 years' time, what would I do to exploit that? I mean, a good example of that is Jeff Bezos. And there's a great video of him back in, I think it was like 1995 or something like that, a long time ago. And he was saying, why did he start in books? And he said to himself that the internet was growing at about 2,000% per annum. So you could see this thing was taking off. And he said, what category of product should I focus on, to exploit the internet to sell? And he decided books was a good choice because there were about 3 million books in circulation, so it's the biggest product category in the world. And no shop can sell 3 million books, but a web shop could. Now, at that time, the internet was terrible. It was dial-up modems, it was very unreliable. It kept dropping out. The web browsers were just atrocious. So it needed a bit of vision to say, when they fix this, what could I sell? But he looked at that new world. The internet was just a new thing coming through, and he said, what that enables me to do is have an infinitely large bookshop. So that's where I'm going to start. So that's just an example of that. Now, we're now seeing sort of, almost infinite possibilities with AI. And one narrative says, okay, that's going to take everyone's job away and we're all doomed. Another narrative says that creates a platform to do things we couldn't do before. So now, rather than programmers write code, they will jockey AI engines to write code, and that certainly means that projects that are so large we don't even contemplate doing them, like getting Fusion to work, for example. We still think that's 30 years away. It's not, because we're getting the tools that they're not bicycles of the mind. They're space rockets of the mind. But we've got to sit on top of those and say, okay, what possibility does that open up? In a world which also has exponentially increasing problems of exponential concern. So you are very much going to be growing up in your adulthood in the exponential age. And the thing about exponentials is they're flat at the start and then they're bewilderingly fast. And when they're flat, everyone assumes that we're in a linear world. It's always going to be like this. I mean, you can see that in the small scale with COVID. Remember, like 3 weeks before it blew up and closed down every city, people were still assuming there was going to be no real issue. We're not good with exponentials. With AI, with global warming, with various other environmental considerations, we've been in an exponential growth for some time, but it was the first half of the exponential, so we couldn't really see it. And now we're in this part of it. So you're going to be entering your careers in the second half of an exponential age, and that's challenging. And there's massive problems to be solved that you're going to have to solve, but there's also massive opportunities to use exponential technologies to solve them. And exponential technologies are interesting because what that means is these are technologies that improve at an exponential rate. So if you were to say, for example, with ChatGPT, it's pretty amazing, but it's also pretty basic as well. Where will that be in 5 years? Or how much will wind power and solar power cost per kilowatt in 5 years' time? These are exponential technologies. Well, it's heading that way. It's not going to get to zero per se, but the marginal cost of each kilowatt will head that way. But 1974, the cost of a watt of solar power was astronomical. In fact, I use the word astronomical. It was only used in satellites. It was just like a really expensive technology, and it's come down 400-fold in that time, and it's projected to become 5 times cheaper in the next few years as well. So we're living in an exponential age, and that makes that idea of saying, what will the world be like? What will the opportunities be? What problems need solving? Makes it quite challenging, because we're not very good at exponential speed. But at the same time, it's pretty exciting if you're an entrepreneur moving into that environment. So the possibilities have not gone away; they've only increased.
So how do you think can one take the biggest chance at utilizing those opportunities to get rid of the world's problems and hopefully not create new ones?
Well, I'd say in the exponential age, we're in a race between 2 exponentials, and who knows which one's going to win. And one of those exponentials is, let's take the climate impending catastrophe. It's becoming exponentially worse, and we're still not quite, as a human species, inculcating that exponential change. And the other exponential is the rate at which exponential technologies become viable and affordable to help mitigate those problems. And where those exponentials cross determine our survival as a species, and the other species on this planet that we are stressing. So I don't know which one of those is going to win, but what we do need is to accelerate the adoption of exponential technologies and get them deployed so that it becomes so compelling that even the vested interests that still push fossil fuels and other value extraction approaches at the expense of the environment, that it becomes so compelling that they still can't argue that case. So people in this room are going to make a difference to that outcome. That's the age we're in. Now, I'm not suggesting everyone here needs to be solving that issue directly, but it's a pretty good place to put your considerable talent. But startups can appear in a lot of places. I was talking to a startup 2 days ago down in the south of Scotland, and they have perfected a scalable solution to extract carbon dioxide from the fermentation process. Now, I don't know if people like drinking alcohol here, but an awful lot of the byproduct of making beer is carbon dioxide. So the solution is needed for that if we're going to keep doing those kind of things. So this person's business extracts all that carbon dioxide and makes it storable underground. And this person's like 29, so we can all do our bit. So I think the environment's rich. It's a bit like I don't know. Does anyone play chess here, for example? Who plays chess? You play chess now. All my life, so I play chess, and all my life, people have been foreshadowing the end of chess because it becomes solved. It becomes a finite problem. But all we discover is that actually the possibilities on the board are extremely rich.
More than stars in the universe.
More than stars in the universe, but the game, in a practical sense, is extremely rich. There's always resources in the position to be exploited if you look hard enough. Resources meaning things that can help you. And life is a lot more complicated than a chess game. So there's degrees of reality none of us can control, but we can interact with them. So don't close your mind down. Don't assume this isn't for you. Don't assume you can't be part of that story and write your page. Open your mind to the possibilities that are coming and make your mark. And I want to stress, we often talk about entrepreneurs. Not everyone needs to be an entrepreneur, but you can join a startup. Startups, if everyone in a startup was an entrepreneur, it would be an absolute shit show, excuse the language. You need to have a range of skills. And often the most annoying person in the company is the founder, right, the entrepreneur. We need their skills, but we also need the people who think, who interact with customers, who help teams work well together, who think about product, who think about marketing. So this isn't about necessarily being an entrepreneur. It's also about being part of a creation journey. So again, don't qualify yourself out because you don't look or sound like someone you saw on TV who said they were an entrepreneur.
That's great. I really loved your advice and your word about agency. So I'd like to ask you, which steps should one take in order to become more independent and less reliant on those conditioning words that it's not meant for me? Like, how do you truly tap to your potential?
Well, what sort of disciplines are people from here tonight? So who's from sort of engineering, for example? Could you raise your hand? And who's from, say, business school? And who's from other things? And what would those other things be?
Politics and film.
Politics and film. Did you raise your hand there, sir? Neurosciences, neuroscience. Now, you're all from very sort of varied backgrounds, and the interesting thing about this is that people from certain disciplines, like I find when I go to the business school, I do some work in a business school, and I find that a lot of the students have like a lot of ideas, entrepreneurial ideas, business ideas. And then I teach a course in the computing science school, and a lot of the students there have the means to prototype these ideas, but maybe aren't so confident about business. And then you've got people, as you mentioned, neuroscience, for example, or film, who really know a domain really well, like the brain or film. And the trouble is that if you only know one of those things, it's hard to know how to start. So the things I would explore are, first of all, if you're not like an engineer, then dabble with the tools that allow you to prototype things. So you can take your ideas and express them in some way. You can build a website to test your idea, or it depends what you're trying to do. But do that, or find an engineer. The thing that upsets me about university is you've got this amazing set of skills here, but we all live in our departments. So the second thing that's important beyond widening your skill set, so let me just, before I move off that point, try and think of yourself as being T-shaped. Now, what do I mean by that? This part of the T is your specialism, like I'm really deep on this. But if you're just I-shaped, you're not really a lot of use to anybody, because nature isn't interested in the functional boundaries, the departmental subject boundaries that we like to hide within. Nature cuts across all that. So you want to add some adjacent skills. Give you an example of that. If you're in marketing, then if you can code a little bit, then you can automate, building 100,000 landing pages for your website, just with a little bit of code, and you're a far, far more valuable marketeer, and you get far more power in the market. So just add a few skills. If you're an engineer, you know nothing about digital marketing, find out a little bit about it. It will make your engineering efforts a lot more valid and a lot more valuable for a business. So you've got to try and be, over time, not all at once, add some adjacent skills, do things that you're uncomfortable with. And the second thing is, join networks. Now, why do that? Because if you're that business school person, you might find that engineer, that neuroscientist, and maybe you'll come up with an idea together, because real creation happens in the gaps between disciplines, not within the disciplines. There's no neuroscientific development that didn't require compute power and software, for example, and there's no software that was useful until it met a domain problem, and so on. And a lot of techie people make horrendous mistakes in business because they don't know anything about business. Like, I'm speaking personally here, in my experience. I'm hopefully not doing that anymore, but I certainly was at the start. So trying to get into a network. Now, the word network scares people. Here's a funny question. How many people here would say they're introverts? And how many people are introverts but were afraid to raise their hand? And I know it's a silly question, but actually probably another same amount. So when someone says network, that's a terribly uncomfortable thought, isn't it? Because
socialize, yeah.
Yeah, it's like you've got to go to some venue and drink cocktails and pretend to be confident.
Terrible.
Now, I'm sure you can do that very well, Matt, but a lot of people can. But that's not actually what networking is. Someone gave me a great definition of networking, which was, it's helping other people when you don't need help. Now think about that. You're at an event like this, and just take the risk of talking to someone you don't know. And let's say you're an engineer and someone from neuroscience comes up and asks you about, how would you like visualize that? Well, help them. You're not going to get anything back right away, but actually over the life cycle you'll get a lot back. So networks are built by people helping each other when they don't need help back, and eventually somewhere through the medium of exchange they'll get help. So it's not about being extrovert, it's not about being super confident and all that sort of stuff. It's just about talking to people by whatever medium works and helping people when you don't necessarily need help. And that's how you'll start to collide skills and meet other people. And regardless of whether or not you become an entrepreneur or not, it will make you better at any job you do. So if you join a company and you're in, who's going to join Morgan Stanley, for example, or JP Morgan, or one of these big companies, or Skyscanner is now a relatively big company. If you end up in one sort of department, make it your business over the next year to meet people from other departments and find out what they do, because that will make you a much more valuable employee, because you can solve business problems, because business problems don't confine themselves to this function or that function. Nature does not respect the boundaries we put up. There's a famous poem, something there is that doesn't love a wall and sends a frozen groundswell underneath. You've got to think that way too. You shouldn't love walls. So, just trying to overcome your kind of natural aversion to kind of talking to other people, and just gently explore in terms that work for you, and you'll find you get a lot back from it. And remember that, help others when you don't need their help will serve you well in life from a network perspective. So become T-shaped and find a way that suits your personality to get into some networks and just explore them. That's a great way to start, I would think.
Thank you for your beautiful words. It's, they say that a specialist is like a tumor. He only grows into one direction. So you got to grow in all directions and remove the boundaries. But just wanted to ask you about, you mentioned some mistakes that you did in the beginning of your journey. I feel like it would be quite worthwhile for us to hear some of your mistakes from your youth when you were just starting out.
Yeah, well, we made so many. It's kind of hard to remember them now.
What was your biggest mistake that you made?
I think. There's a few, but I remember. So my sort of, after our database, our hospital database thing, I was in this startup, and we were basically trying to create a product that could manage really large scale networks, because when broadband technology went into every home, that was going to need massive networks, and they're going to be massively scaled, and you'd need to have software to manage those. So we were writing that software, and I remember sitting next to my CEO, and we weren't writing it at the time, we were making something else at the time, and we somehow managed to get into a meeting with one of the telcos, one of the telecom companies, and they were saying, okay, we're going to do this trial, and we're going to use this equipment from this company, this equipment from that company, but we don't have any management software for it. So does anyone do that? And I was sitting next to my CEO, and he put his hand up. Yeah, we've got that, he said. So that's news to me. So then they gave us the business, but we didn't have the product, and we had 3 months to write it. And we did write it. There was a lot of late nights, like really late nights. But we got this product built, and we sold it, and we were all heroes. And then that gave us the idea that you could sell stuff and create the product later. So our ambitions grew, so we then, our CEO signed us up for an even bigger stretch, and we got that done.
Sounds like a very slippery slope.
Yeah, it was, because eventually we got into a situation where we didn't really realise we were deceiving ourselves. We thought that this would always get away with this, and we sort of did. But what it meant was that eventually that company we sold that company to Cisco, and the software we had was okay, but didn't do everything that we'd sort of thought it was going to be able to do, and we didn't manage to get all that done in time. And it made life really difficult, because the customer was disappointed, the acquiring company was disappointed, and it created a lot of stress, and it made me really ill. I was the VP of engineering. I learned a lesson that it's just, you've got to be 100% honest in business. You've got to sell what you have, not what you think you're going to have. And people fall into that. We can sort of, they say fake it till you make it, but you've got to be careful with that phrase. Fake it till you make it works well when it means I'm not very confident I'm going to give this a go and I'm going to try and learn the skills as I go. When it comes to your product, you shouldn't do that. It's the lesson I learned. You should sell what you have, because eventually it will find you out. And I learned that lesson painfully. I mean, we did create a product, it did work, but it was extremely stressful, and I became ill, and I learned a lot of lessons from that. So yeah, that would be one sort of major error. Although, if you read it in the newspapers and so on, it sounds like it was all very successful, but underlying, it was the wrong way to build product.
So the commandment, don't lie, applies to business, first of all.
Or even, we didn't think we were lying, we thought we were exaggerating. But it's the same thing.
It's all just white lies.
Yeah, it's just because we actually thought we could.
Sleepless nights as well.
Yeah, the trouble with software engineers is we always dramatically underestimate how long it takes to do stuff. So we thought, we could get that done in the time, But to give you an example, there's a kind of rule in software that if you build a specific product to solve a customer's problem, you can do it in a certain time. If you want to try and generalize that into a framework that everyone can use, it will take about 7 times longer. And I remember there was like 6 of us in a room and saying, okay, we're going to take what we've done for these 2 customers and we're going to turn it into a framework, sell that framework, we can manage any customer's equipment in the world. And it's going to take us about another 6 months, we said. And 7 years later, we still hadn't built all of that software, but we'd sold it, and that was a problem. So it was good enough to get by, but it was a very stressful journey, and it wasn't fun. And I learned a lot of lessons from that. Made a lot of other mistakes as well, but that one I reflect on.
The biggest one, yeah. Thank you.
Well, yeah, the one I can remember tonight. There's probably lots of others, but so yeah.
That's perfect. Well, thank you for the advice you've given us. I feel like now would be a good time to discover a little bit about your journey with Skyscanner. So you were the COO. Could you just a little bit, because I feel like everyone knows what a CEO does. Mm-hmm. So what does a COO do?
Yeah, so what a COO does, a COO is you basically manage the entire company operationally, and it depends on the company. It depends on who the CEO is. You've got it's a kind of complementary relationship. So my story there was, and there's a few lessons here I think for everybody. So by the time I was in Skyscanner, I had done my little database. I'd done Atlantic, which was this company I was telling you about. After we'd been acquired by Cisco, I spent about 3 years in Cisco as a director of software engineering there. And then I left to start another company called Sumerian, which was a big data company before there was big data as a term, which was interesting. Spent 7 years there, which is probably too long. And then fell out with the CEO, with the disagreement on direction, and also I thought he was a bit of a dick. So I'm not sure what he thought, but that's what I thought. And eventually it's time to leave. So I actually ended up back in Cisco as a global program manager. So that was an interesting job. And while I was there, that was all going really well. It was a pretty stressful job, but it was going really well. I had 3 young boys who are now actually the age of people here tonight, but in that time they were all under 10. And Cisco job paid well. And I'd got to know the CEO of Skyscanner, Gareth Williams, through the network. And I'd meet him sometimes. The company was pretty small. It was like sort of 40, 50 people at the time. And he'd ask me for advice on, what did you do when you got to this size, and so on and so forth. So we'd talk about these things. And then one day he came along to see me and asked me to join the company. And at the time, Skyscanner as an employer of senior people didn't have a great reputation, because a lot of startups get this problem where the founders and the early employees find it really difficult to grow, and they tend to hold the company back. Not Gareth, but hold the company back. And therefore, when they try and hire people in who are more senior, or senior who can help them grow, there's an antibody response, and those people tend to leave again. So I was well aware of this. It was well known in the market that Skyscanner wasn't the place you went as a senior exec. And so I was pretty wary about it. And I was thinking about my 3 boys and got to earn money, so I don't want to screw this up. So I had quite a lot of conversations with Gareth. And then one day, I thought to myself, on the other hand, I can see that if this is done well, so the company was really struggling with growth at the time. It was, the organisation was a bit, it wasn't scaling. It was no one in the company knew how to grow an organisation. It was a bit broken, and people were falling out with each other. But the product concept was strong, and I thought if we could get this right, this is a really exciting thing happening here in Scotland, and I'd kind of regret not doing it. So I was going back and forward on this stuff, and eventually I said to Gareth, look, what you need is a chief operating officer, someone who takes over the management of the whole thing and lets you focus on the vision for the company. And if you offer me that job, I'll join. And I was sure he'd say no. So I thought, when he says no, I can just forget about this and go back to what I was doing. But he came back and said yes. And I thought, oh, that's a problem. So I said, well, tell you what, you'll have to pay me this much or I'm not coming. I thought, he's definitely not going to say yes to that. And he said yes to that. So, okay. I said, you'll have to give me this much stock or I'm not coming. And I was hoping he would say no each time, just make it easy for me. But anyway, he said yes, so I joined. And
give me your soul.
Well, it wasn't like that, but there was, the first week in Skyscanner, I was speaking to people, and a senior marketing person said to me, the thing you have to understand, Mark, about Skyscanner is the company's about to implode organisationally. I thought, that's an interesting word. Different from explode, so that's good, but it's less messy when things implode. But that's not, that's interesting. I actually saw that as an opportunity. So I thought, thank goodness it gives me something to do, because I knew I could fix that. I knew I could make that work, because the experiences I had in earlier startups, the things I got wrong and right, told me what I needed to do. So that's when I joined, and then we spent the next 5 years, solving those issues, and then going on a kind of amazing journey, which was always a bit scary, exciting but terrifying, and eventually ended up with about 100 million users a month, and a 1.45 billion sale. So I was glad I made that decision. But the point I'm making is these things aren't as straightforward as they look. But the thing you have to recognise is a senior employee, that people don't want to hire you into an expensive job unless they've got a whole ton of problems. But it doesn't say that in the job advert. It's like, come to help us continue our smooth growth, it'll say. And then you get in there and realise that everything's broken. And that's why they're spending money on a senior person. And it's amazing. I work with a lot of senior people. I meet a lot of senior people. I've mentored a lot of senior people. I'm always amazed how surprised they are when they turn up in a startup or a scale-up and say, well, it's a real mess in there. Everything's going wrong. My job's really stressful.
There's growth, but it's not smooth.
Yeah, it's like, I always say technology is not a technology problem. It's a people problem. You can build anything nowadays if you can conspire together to do it. So what I liked about my job in Skyscanner was it was a people play. It was like, how do we become more than the sum of our parts? And you have to remember that Google was trying to kill Skyscanner. Priceline, which owns Booking.com, it's now called Booking Holdings, was trying to kill Skyscanner. Why was that? Because we were taking their market share, and they didn't like that. So you're competing with these companies, and you have to be more than the sum of your parts. You can't be like 90 individuals or 100 individuals. We obviously got bigger than that. You have to be much more than that, and that's about human dynamics. It's about the structures. It's about the processes. It's about making people exceed the personal limitations that they've set for themselves, and it's really, really interesting, and it's really exciting, and it's at times it's a bit scary, but the point is that it makes your heart beat faster. And if I was to give you one rule to navigate your lives, it's do things that make your heart beat faster, because that's living. And there's an awful lot of people who are my age who didn't do the things that I tried to do, who they took other choices, but now their hearts are beating slowly, and they're resentful, and they're cynical. Never be that. Never be cynical. Never move before you become resentful. And the thing about startups is you're going to have some horrendous experiences in them. You're going to get burned awfully badly, and you're going to have exhilarating experiences. But at all times your heart's beating faster, and that means you're alive. And that's how you should steer your ship of life. Is my heart beating faster? So I don't know if that makes sense to everybody, but it's what guided me.
Listen to your heart, right?
Yeah, it sounds a bit like a cheesy 90s pop song. I think there was one called that. Who was that by? Does anyone remember? Listen to your heart.
We weren't born in the 90s.
I'm sure that was a Swedish pop song, but it was it was a great song. Anyway, but don't listen to your heart. Make your heart beat faster. Now, for example, you're all at university. I bet your hearts have beaten faster a few times here, right? Am I good enough to be here? Am I as good as the people around me? You know, should I travel to a tiny country in Scotland and bear the Scottish winter to study here? You know, if you're part of that experience. That's great. You're already doing those things. Keep doing them, you know.
So what would you say were the biggest challenges to startup when Google was trying to get rid of you, Booking.com was trying to get rid of you? And what was the selling point of Skyscanner? How does Skyscanner make revenue in general?
Well, I mean, those are the best times when someone's trying to
undermine you,
kill your business. Those are the best times because humanity is an odd combination of competitive and collaborative. And we're at our very best when we have a competitive threat that requires us to collaborate. You know, that's exciting. The times I was most uncomfortable were when everything was going really well, because I knew that we were going to become complacent. And you know what I and others tried to do in Skyscanner was think of a spectrum, and at one end of that spectrum there's complacency. So, for example, in Skyscanner we were a pretty cool software company, and we're doing pretty well, so it was very easy for everyone to become complacent. And at the other end of that spectrum is paralysis through fear. Google's coming to try and kill us, or other bogeymen are going to emerge from the night and take us out. So people become afraid to act. And where you want to be is in the middle of that spectrum, the point of restlessness. So I always try to remind people that we weren't competing with Google, we were competing with other human beings in Google. And the question was, we were going to decide before we'd started that they were better than us, or were we going to find out, were we going to play the game, have the fight and find out. And I think people respond well to that after some initial fear. But again, that's living. So that's how we competed. I mean, how does Skyscanner make money? I mean, I don't speak for the company anymore, so I don't want to say too much. But basically, by helping users find good travel options and directing them to those travel options, and in return for that, the companies on the other side of that network pay Skyscanner a small amount of money for each transaction that comes to them, and that's like 20 pence, 50 pence, things like that. If you've got 100 million users, it's a business. So that's basically how it works.
That's crystal clear. You said one thing about being more than just the sum of your parts, and about having a good human dynamic in your company. Mm-hmm. How do you improve that? What does your company culture should be built on to encourage that?
Yeah, well, I think I always try to think of this in terms of there's a few scientific people here, and we've all probably studied the idea that you can't create or destroy energy. There's only a fixed amount of energy in the universe, and that's true as far as we know, except for human energy. You can create human energy where there wasn't some, and you can destroy it. So I think the trick of leadership, and leadership isn't about the person with the fanciest title. We all of us can be leaders. Leadership in a team moves around the room depending on what's happening in a given day. But leadership is about creating that human energy. So it's about reinforcing the good things people do. It's about having a clear vision that excites people. It's about not punitively deriding people or criticizing them when they make mistakes, but rather helping them to grow from those experiences. It's a person by, you manage a big team person by person, and we're all a bit different, but you're trying to make sure that you're creating more energy, more belief, and you also have to hold yourselves to a high standard. So, for example, what the internet has done is it's brought every customer on earth within competitive reach of any country on earth, no matter where you live, but it's also brought every competitor within reach of your customers. So if you want to be a successful company, you've got to be as good as the best company in the world at what you do. And that requires you to constantly learn from outside the company. So the big mistake that a lot of companies make is to learn from themselves. Well, last year we did 10 of those, now we're doing 11. But maybe your competitor's doing 1,000. So we spent a lot of time looking outside Skyscanner to say what is best practice. And you'll find that in my industry, you'll find that in Silicon Valley, you'll find it in Beijing, for example. You'll find it in a lot of interesting places. And we try and take that best practice back and then improve upon it, add our piece to it. So that combination of trying to get people to exceed their own expectations for themselves, trying to create energy and not take it away from a team. There's a lot to be done to make that happen, but that's the kind of goal. And trying to learn from outside ourselves is really useful. I mean, for example, I'd love this university to be like really outwardly focused, and in many ways it is, and learn from other universities around the world to be the best university it can be. That's how you become the best at something. And also that's why I was saying earlier that don't stay in your discipline, learn from people from other disciplines. That makes you better at your discipline. So again, avoid walls. It's very easy to create narratives that tell us why we can be lazy. You've got to be careful with those.
So how would you keep yourself accountable? How would you make sure that you are performing to your best abilities?
Well, I mean, it's funny when you're in a senior position in a company. There's an awful lot of people who are there to keep you accountable. Your board of investors, your directors, the people in your team.
C-suite.
The so-called C-suite. Yeah, well, I was part of that so-called C-suite. But I'll give you an example. So I just found it was always important to be a bit on edge about my own development. Like if you're in a company that's growing, it's doubling every year in size, it means that every 6 months it's like a different company. You're trying to do the same things, but it can't work the same way. And for the people in that company, especially some of the more senior people, especially the founder, you've got to reinvent yourself regularly. So what used to work for you at one level of scale works against you at the next level of scale. And that's very disorientating because our natural behaviour is to cling to what used to work.
Could you give an example?
Yeah, I'll give you a really simple example. Let's say that you and I start a company tomorrow. How do we do our kind of strategizing and kind of comms? We go to the bar nearby after a long week and we just talk about it and have a beer or something. And then we hire everyone in the front row here joins the company, and we still do it that way. But it turns out that 3 of the people in the front row, that doesn't suit them. Maybe got a family, don't like pubs, so they're not there for the comms. So they're not getting the comms. They're not really sure what's going on. Now, are they neutral about that? No, they're not. They're resentful of it. You haven't updated your model for communications to suit the bigger team, and you've disenfranchised people, and they're not neutral about it. They're kind of angry about it. So that's a really, really trivial example. But what worked really well when it was 4 of us, getting around a table informally, doesn't work at even just the next small level of scale up. Now you'll find that's true of everything. For example, it's true of your people. You might find someone who's great at managing 3 people, but terrible at managing 10. So what do you do about that? The company has to prepare for that change and invest heavily in those people. You might find that your software release process works really well when you've got 4 developers, but breaks at 20. All real examples, by the way. You might find that your bug fixing process slows down catastrophically when you've got above a certain number of bugs. So you've always got to be looking at those things. But for you personally, you also have to be changing, because it's one thing to manage. Just for example, in Skyscanner, I was managing 100 people, then 200, then 400, then 1,000. And the things I did to do that had to change, as the company grew. And that's quite challenging. But I'll give you an example of where complacency can creep up on you in interesting ways. And the people who most hold you to account for leadership are the people in the company, not the not the board, but the people that are supposedly reporting to you. And we did an interesting example, which I always remembered, which was in Skyscanner, we always said that one of our convictions was the customer is always first. We do always act in the best interest of our users. Now, that meant that we used to not always take revenue we could have taken if it in any way affected the customer experience, because we thought in the long term customers will reward us for that. But I remember there was one thing where a lot of our competitors did this thing that when you clicked, you searched for a flight, we'd come back with results, but they'd also pop up some boxes from some affiliated partners. And users didn't really like that because you got all these other boxes appearing, but it was very lucrative. These companies would pay a lot of money for that. And we thought, yeah, we'll do that as well. And it added £1 million to our revenue a month, which was a lot at the time. So we felt, that was a good decision. Customers seemed to be okay with it. A few complained, but it seems to be fine. But we had this stairwell in Skyscanner where it was painted with a sort of special paint where anyone could write on it. And so people would write things like, come to the barbecue on Friday, or stuff like that. And I was walking down the stairs one day and I saw someone put a $sign on the wall. I thought, that's a bit odd. And I didn't pay any more attention. And then a week later I came by and there was another $sign on the other wall. And I thought, someone's making a point here about something and it's kind of annoying me. And I wasn't that interested in money. I was interested in the company being successful. So I was like, why are they doing that? And then a few days later, there was another $sign. I thought, I'm going to rub those out because this company's not about dollars, it's about customer. And then another $sign appeared. And I mailed the company and said, who's ever doing a $sign? Can you stop doing the $signs? It's annoying. What's that about? Another $sign appeared. And then I realised what it was about. Is we had said we always put the customer first, but we just put a thing in that got us $1 million a month extra revenue, but it was bad for the customer. And one of the engineers was telling me that. He didn't say it to my face, but that's really what the message was. So our convictions were that we should always do the right thing for the customer, and someone in the team was reminding us that actually you're no longer being authentic as a leadership team. So we actually took that out. The $signs went away. The board wasn't very happy. It's a hard conversation to have. We have just decided to take out $1 million of revenue because we don't think it's the right thing, and their employees are reminding us of that. The rest is history, right? So, I think it was the right decision because we had great customer retention, customers referred other customers, and it also reminds me of something really important that, I suspect everyone in this room has like 1,000 opinions on things. If I said to you now, what do you think of ChatGPT? You give me an opinion. We're good at that. Leadership teams need opinions too, but there's a subset of opinions that need to be convictions. Now, the difference between convictions and opinions are that opinions, if you give me a better argument, I'm going to change my opinion, but I don't change my convictions. So I would urge you, if you become a founder or whatever you do in life, to try to develop an awareness of your convictions, the things you really hold true, really, really believe. And then you don't give those up lightly. Now, sometimes they turn out to be wrong and you've got to do that. But, a founding team that doesn't have convictions and just has opinions is going to struggle. And what we'd done there is we'd actually violated one of our convictions. And after that, we talked about mistakes earlier. I probably would have mentioned this one as well. Don't wander too far from your convictions because they're there for a reason. So you think about that in your lives. What is it I believe and what's a deep-seated conviction? And then preserve those and nourish those convictions. Now, some people here, you may be too young to have developed that sense of conviction, maybe a bit more life experience, maybe you don't. But be aware of that you want to try and separate opinions from convictions. And if you're a founder, you want to have convictions about your market, convictions about your product, not too many of them, but enough to guide you during these hard times. Because if you don't have them, like our board could have said, £12 million a year because you think customers might be a little bit annoyed. Don't be so silly, slap, 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 slap. And we'd have taken it away again. But because that was a conviction, which I give all credit to CEO Gareth for that, and we inherited that conviction. Because it was a conviction, we stood our ground, and in the end, the long-term growth of the company was better. So your convictions don't have to be self-originated. You can borrow them from other people, but make sure you know what your convictions are and honour them.
And be ready to stand for them. That's great.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, we're a bit running out of time, so I'm just going to ask you 2 last questions, and then we want to have our guests ask some questions as well, because they're big questions. So my question would be, what is your conviction on success? How do you define success?
Well, I can tell you what it isn't. It's not about money and it's not about social media clicks. I I think it's about, we've all got talents and we've all got effort that can maximise those talents. And if you get to the end of a cycle, a day, a month, a year, a life, and you have tried to maximise your talents through the effort that you apply to get them in contact with the world, I think that's success. And I'm struck, so I have a class of 100 wonderful students. I'm a part-time professor here. Wonderful students. At my age, you're supposed to say, the next generation, they've got it too easy, and nowadays it's much harder, and all that stuff. Complete nonsense. This is a wonderful, wonderful generation, and I look at the pressures that you're under, and the measures of success that society tells you should conform to, and it's all bullshit. I think that success is, are you trying to develop your talents and are you trying to employ them in some fashion that's worthwhile? And if you can look yourself in the mirror and say, I'm doing that, then you're successful. And more kind of arbitrary measures of, wealth or, other stuff, these are, they might make your life more or less comfortable, but it don't mean you're more or less successful. So that's where you should start, because there's an awful lot of wonderful people in your generation that think they're not successful, and that's a tragedy. And then they start talking themselves out of life. So don't do that.
There's hope, guys. we're a great generation. All right, and then you are an investor yourself right now, is that correct?
Yeah, sometimes.
Sometimes, depending on the mood. So as an investor, what are the things that you look at when you're investing in a startup?
So when I invest in a startup, which isn't that often, because I'm yet to convince myself I'm any good at it, but when I invest, the first thing you're looking at is actually the founder or the founding team, and you're looking, startups are an exciting life and so on, but it's also really, really tough. So you're looking for somebody who you think is going to have that resilience, and also is going to be able to reinvent themselves, as I said earlier, at different levels of scale. A lot of startups fail because the founder does not reinvent herself. Was successful at one scale and then decides that that's good enough, and it holds the rest of the company back. I often say that you've got to grow with a company, or the company will grow without you. The exception is the founder. If the founder doesn't grow with the company gets shackled to that founder's kind of lack of growth. So I'm looking for someone with that. You've probably heard of a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. You're looking for that kind of mentality. And then on the product, what I'm personally looking for is some kind of ability to have network effects or compounding growth. So one of the startups I was in was a linear business. Sumerian was a linear business. We did consultancy, and the more consultancy we did, the more money we earned. That's a linear business. Nothing wrong with it. I mean, it works. Like Accenture does that, and it's a big business. But
it's not exponential.
It's not exponential. Whereas Skyscanner is an exponential business, because while we're having this discussion here, users or travelers are being attracted by the fact there's all these suppliers who are being attracted by the fact there's all these travelers. So that's it's hard to get those going. It's very hard, but they can really grow, to quite a large size quickly. So those are interesting sort of businesses. So I tend to look at those. So it'd be those kind of combinations. A lot of investors would be looking at those kind of aspects. So yeah, that's how I think about it.
That's great. Thank you so much. Now, since we have so many guests, I think we're gonna limit the amount of questions. So we're probably gonna ask around the first 5, 6, 7 questions maybe. So. Guys, I'll just give you a microphone and then you can pass it around.
Mostly during the start and a little bit at the end is there. Again, you were talking about how growth of this generation is very exponential. And I think a big factor in our modern economy which has made growth so exponential is obviously the internet and being able to guide services through almost omnipresent data mining. My concern as an artist and business person is that most of these exponentially growing businesses depend on taking everyone's data against their will or invasively. and then essentially storing all of that data in a very exclusive oligarchic community, to build a community of businessmen. My question for you is, do you believe this is a set norm for how the internet is used to run our international economies? Or do you believe that in the coming decades, perhaps services may exist which perhaps profit off providing a social good and provide means of accessing, analyzing, and utilizing data transparently so that it's kept within the public space?
Yes, that's a really interesting question. So let's look at a couple of things. A lot of the companies we used to admire, Facebook, Twitter, to take a couple of examples, we don't admire them so much anymore, do we? Probably not. I mean, there's different views. But I remember when like Facebook was the darling of, the startup world. I remember being in Facebook in Menlo Park over in San Francisco, and it was just like, oh, this place is so cool. And now it's like, one of the kind of empires of evil. Now what happened there? There's a term that's used. It's not a particularly formal term. It's the enshittification of platforms or networks. Now, what does that mean?
Did you say
Enshittification with the word shit, S-H-I-T. Because let's look at that journey, right? You start off with a network or a platform. It tries to be really good to its users first. So that's the great period when we all fall in love with that product. And then it moves to the point where it wants to be good to its suppliers at the expense of its users, so that it can get more of them locked in. And then eventually it wants to be good to its shareholders, so it's bad to its users and its suppliers. If you take, Facebook, for example, so initially it was like, hey, you can connect all your friends, and our mission is to make everyone meet everybody. It's going to be a wonderful world. And then the mission swapped to being, we've got to attract suppliers onto this platform, advertisers and content producers. So we're going to make it really easy for them, and we're going to use your data to do it. So we're now starting to treat you a bit badly as a user.
Commodify our everyday existence.
Yeah, or
ownership to all of our personal life.
Yeah, overreach into your personal life so you can be good to the supplier, and eventually, once the suppliers are locked in, because everyone has to be in Facebook to advertise because there's nowhere else, then that's when you can withdraw the goodwill towards suppliers, and you can start to, they've got to pay you more to get listed anywhere and on the feed, etc., and it becomes less and less attractive to be on that platform. You've got nowhere else to go. So a lot of platforms go through this so-called enshittification process. Now, what I've just described is a business model that a lot of platforms use. Now, we were talking earlier about innovation, about creativity, about the opportunities for this generation to do things differently. There's got to be a better business model than that. And the reason I think that will actually come to the fore is because once people keep seeing the same nihilistic pattern repeated and all the products you used to love, I mean, TikTok's already doing that. So right now, on TikTok, you think that it's showing you the videos that are most suited to your interests, but it's actually showing the videos that some of them get boosted, get warmed up. What's the word to use? Heated videos, which really means if you pay me more money as a video maker, we'll stick you further up the rankings. So they're already starting to go the same way. So I think enough people will rebel against that other business models will become attractive. Now let's look at one other aspect of that, which is the whole capitalist economic system relies on infinite growth in a finite environment. So that's not going to work, is it? It's already not working. So that requires not just us to have different business models for frivolous social media sites, it also requires us to have a different economic model. And in your generation, that is going to come to a head, is coming to a head. Now that again creates interesting opportunities, So I think that, things are never fixed. And when I talk about opportunities and big opportunities and exciting and transformational change, it's because the system's not stable, and that will require change. And it's an exciting time to be alive. Sometimes excitement isn't what you asked for, but that's what we've got.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Can you pass to Charlie right next to you, and then to the row at the back.
You mentioned the threats that are currently facing humanity as a species, and how we're kind of at the precipice of a turning point where if we keep going the way we're going, we're really putting the whole humanity at risk. I've thought about that a lot, and I think one of the main problems with the business models associated with that is that the benefits of that are distributed between the global populations. There's not necessarily one customer. So how would you tackle these problems from a business sense, and how would you make your time worthwhile? What's the business model there?
Well, I think the problem with our system is that increasingly wealth is concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer people, and that's a recipe for social disorder. It's certainly a recipe for grinding poverty. So how do we change that model is an interesting question. There's an interesting, if you go back 100 years, there's an interesting book called Progress in Poverty. And what it says is that the richer a society gets, the more extreme poverty becomes. And why is that? In those days, it's because as land became more productive, the workers didn't get paid anymore for that. The people who invested the money in that factory didn't make any more money from it. The people who owned the land made the money because the land was more productive. It was therefore more valuable, and therefore all the money flowed to the landowners. Now the landowners today are on the internet. Well, like Google's a landowner, Facebook's a landowner, because the more productive our advertising and more ingenious our advertising strategies become, the more you have to pay to advertise on Google. So we've still got this problem in our society where we tend to flow to the landowner sometimes being virtual, and the only way you really fix that is by adjusting the taxation system to tax those unproductive parts of society where the wealth flows to. So if you wouldn't necessarily tax somebody who's improving land, putting a hospital on it and stuff like that, but you might tax the person who's holding the land more. So I think that there's some extreme views that say you should only have taxes on land ownership and not on anything else. I don't know if that's right or not, but I think we do need to reflect on these issues that tend to disincentivize the super concentration of wealth, because that's not a sustainable model. Now, I don't know exactly how we bring that about, but I think that's what we should be thinking about. So that's why, innovation is not about creating products only. It's about creating business models. It's about creating societal models. It's about going to politics and changing how it works. These things are all in front of you, and they're unavoidable. So I think these are the sort of things that should be in the discourse.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you for your time. I have 4 questions, but just like pick 2 since we are running out of time. And also, you're giving so much examples about the chess at work, and you love playing chess. And there's a quote from famous Danish grandmaster, Ben Larsen, like one variation, and you just like reply to that. You're looking for immediate to medium term ways to gain position of improvement, over victory is more likely. So is it the same case when it comes to finding out what you want to do or what you learn?
Yeah. So I'll repeat that question because it's a very interesting question. So in chess, Bent Larsen, I'm not sure how to say that name, but one of my favourite chess players, he said long variation, wrong variation. Now what he means by that is if you try and calculate deeply in a chess game, you're going to go wrong. So that's not actually how the best players play chess. They try to strive for positional improvement. They look a bit, how can I make my position a bit better? And once I'm there, how do I make it a bit better again? Now, if you apply that to life, does anyone here have a 5-year plan? Anyone want to admit to that? Probably a few people do, and probably a lot of us do, but we're maybe going to put our hands up. The problem with 5-year plans is that they're fragile, because a lot of the things that your plan requires to happen are not in your control. And when you get 2 years into that plan and COVID happens, well, does that mean you're a failure because your 5-year plan failed? So you've got to be careful, long variation, wrong variation. You've got to be careful planning too far ahead. What I recommend, and this is just my opinion, you can take it or leave it, is you have to create options for yourself. And then as life throws different things at you, you can take one option or another. Now, what does it mean to create options? Well, learn new stuff, So like I said, be T-shaped. What I mean is learn new stuff, and that will take you new directions, and you don't know what those directions are going to be. So always be learning. I mean, it doesn't end after university. Thankfully, it's not quite so grindingly painful as it is at university, but you've got to keep learning, and that will create options. And you can't predict where you're going to be in 10, 20 years, so don't even try. Just keep creating options for yourself, and you'll probably find you can navigate life. So that's what I'd say to that.
Sorry, the last question. What age were you at when you saw the advert for a very small startup company, Cumbernauld?
Say again, sorry, I didn't
What
quite.
age were you at when you see the advert from the small startup at the
What?
Cumbernauld?
What age was I?
Yeah.
I joined that startup when I was 23, I think it was.
So you would be able to just say one sentence to your 23-year-old version. What would it be?
I would say step towards interesting, risky things, not away from them. So that was a crazy thing to go and join that startup, because it was like 5 or 6 people. It was in the middle of nowhere. Cumbernauld is somewhere, I'm not saying that, but this particular business park was in the middle of nowhere, or maybe even on the edge of nowhere. And it was like, a cold, drafty, like tin shed masquerading as an office, and had nothing in common with the people. But I sort of thought, there's something here. And I'm going to extend that idea a little bit. How do you end up in a leadership position? Is it you'd study the right degree and you know the right people? That's not what it's about.
You start with the executive position.
You can do that. But how you do it, and again, this works if you're an introvert or an extrovert, is when in business there are always problems, and you'll find that in any population, most people take a step back from the problem, and 1 or 2 people step towards the problem and try and do something about it. And if you step towards problems often enough, you'll suddenly find yourself running the place. And it's as simple as that. So it's like, well, what do you mean we're losing customers? Well, I'm the database guy. I don't do customers. Let me know when the problem's fixed, though. Or you say, let me see if I can help with that. And that's that. So you step towards the light, and sometimes the light's hot and blinding, and that's the advice I would give you. Not one sentence, but sorry.
Thank you. Any more questions?
There's a hand over here.
Hi, my name is Logan from the FinTech program at the University. I have 2 questions basically. So, when you were the COO, did you have experiences in automation or automating certain tasks? And do you consider yourself as an advocate for automation, for increasing efficiency and effectiveness? And my second question is, what technical skills should one acquire in this case of increasing the utility of AI and automation?
So that's a really interesting question. Automation. There's a lot of people out there just now busy automating stuff that shouldn't even exist. There's a lot of people automating things that are not the problem. So I don't advocate ever rushing to automation. What I advocate instead is think of it this way. You've got some process with 100 steps in it, and it all looks very complicated, but it's not going fast enough. Do you automate that process? No. What you do is you look for the constraint on that process. Now, what I mean by that is if you imagine a whole bunch of pipes with water flowing through them, and all these pipes are different thicknesses, the thinnest pipe governs the overall rate of water flow. No matter how many pipes there are or how thick the other pipes are, it's always the thinnest pipe. And in a process, it's the same. There's only one stage in any process that currently governs its speed. So your task isn't to automate the process, it's to find that single pipe and make it a bit wider. And then you might decide to automate that step, or you might decide to do something else. But you've got to be very careful with optimization and automation. Elon Musk says something I think is really interesting. He says the biggest or the most common mistake that very talented engineers make is to optimize something that shouldn't exist. You know, so you shouldn't have had it in the first place, but you're busy optimizing it or automating it. I think that's those two things. You know, find the thinnest pipe and ask yourself, should this thing exist before I start optimizing it? For example, one of Elon Musk's company's process steps is always try to delete the part or the process. You know, does that rocket need that fin on it? Does that process need that step? And only when you can't delete it do you then try and optimize it. So that's how I think about it. Then in terms of AI and what skills you need for that, I would urge everybody to get comfortable with machine learning as a concept. You know, if you're a programmer, you go and do the deep Coursera courses on it and build your own. Even though you won't actually be writing it soon, you'll be using other engines, which we're already doing. If you're not a technical person, it's very easy to be afraid of AI and go, what's that? Do an introductory course to AI and find out what it's about. You know, be T-shaped, and it'll really help you understand how you can wield these technologies and what's coming next. That's what I'd say to that.
Thank you very much for getting on your time tonight. Really insightful to listen to.
Thank you.
So you spoke a wee bit about constantly making sure that you're learning and developing yourself. In regards to learning from others, who are the key people that you learn from at different stages in your career?
No, that's a great question. I mean, you learn. I will answer the question, but I should say, if you're open to learning, you learn a lot from everybody. You know, I learned a lot of my best management lessons from having really bad bosses sometimes, and I said, I'm not going to do that. But I'll give you one. There was one guy in my career who I learned like a lot from, and he was a terrifying person. For a long time, I was very scared of him, but he taught me a lot of great lessons, and he did it through analogy. And he was just like, and what I realised he was a first principles thinker. He would always think about problems from their fundamentals, And I remember, I was in a startup, and we were building this big system, and we were doing things like we were saying, well, we could use Oracle as a database. This is going back a few years before everyone here was born. Well, not everybody. So we thought, well, we can build a better database for this specific need. So we're building this database, and we can build a better message bus than the commercial message bus because we've got special needs. We're building a special message bus, and I'm doing all this stuff. And this guy was like, "Why the hell are you doing that?" He said, "Do you realise that Oracle have invested $20 billion in that database, and you think that 100 folks in Cumbernauld can build a better one?" And we all felt a bit embarrassed. And he said, "Look," he said, "have you ever seen that movie Waterworld?" Now, you might not remember Waterworld, but Waterworld was infamous for being the first $200 million movie back in the 90s, and it wasn't very good. So, it was like Kevin Costner. Remember Kevin Costner? It wasn't a very good film. It wasn't his best film. And he said to me, "Do you know why I went to see Waterworld?" I said, "Why?" He said, "So bad." No, he said, "Because for a $5 ticket, I got a $200 million movie, and that's leverage." And I was like, and I never forgot that lesson. It's like, God, you're right. And suddenly everything made sense. So he taught me a lot of things. But the reason I remember them is because I was pretty terrified of him, and he always had these absolutely fantastic analogies. He came to see us and said, he was very angry because our software wasn't ready, and he said, you've built this software. It's like, it's a Ferrari body, but there's the engine of a Ford Fiesta inside. It's on the racetrack, but it's never going to win. So we went through hell to put the equivalent of a Ferrari engine in, and we came to meet him. He said,